Thank you all for being here. Thank you for taking time out of your summer to come and have a conversation with us. My name is Yao Nialko. I am with Bill Easterly, the co-director of the Development Research Institute. We've been hosting a number of seminars and events this academic year. We're very happy to have a good friend of ours come over. I've known him for pretty much my entire professional career. He began, I believe, at the University of Dar es Salaam and then moved to the World Bank. If any of you are looking for a summary of what's going on in Africa, just Google him and look at some of his review papers. They're just unbelievably good. So he had his time at the World Bank. We've had President Kikwete, the immediate past president of Tanzania. He's been in residence. He's writing his book here at NYU. And I was speaking to him, and he was telling me about this wonderful man. He said he was a very, very smart guy. And so I just pulled him out of wherever he was working, and I made him the central bank governor. Okay, and he was very, very proud of that. That's what President Kikwete said. So he served as the central bank governor of Tanzania for the past 10 years. And I think it was around January when he stepped down from it. And he is now the Mwalimu Nyerere Chaired Professor of Development at the University of Dar es Salaam. He's there reflecting, writing, and as part of that, we're very, very happy to have him here to speak to us. And I shouldn't forget, he's also a farmer. Okay, he's got his farm in Tanzania, and he's very, very proud of that. So I would have been in trouble if I didn't mention that. So please, let's welcome Dr. Benno Ndulu. He's going to give us a great talk about what's going on in Africa today. Benno.
Well, let me begin first by thanking the Institute and Africa House more specifically for giving me an opportunity to come and share some thoughts with you about a continent that I cannot give up about, because that's my life, it's our life, and also to acknowledge the immense intellectual community that is here in the room now. I've known the work of a good number of them, and definitely I've worked with a few from afar. Okay, now I'm going to go through two main parts in my talk. The first part would be just to set the baseline on where the continent now is, making a distinction between the 40 years to around 2000 and the 2 decades after that, which have made quite a big change, which I would like to share with you, but that's only a baseline. Then I'll talk a bit about the new technological realities which the region may have to cope with. I happen also to be a co-director with Stefan Dekon for a commission on technology and inclusive development. We are working out of Oxford on that. So some of these observations partly will draw from the work that we are reviewing now. This is a 2-year initiative in a crowded space, but we focus more on developing country perspectives in relation to this. Then spend a bit of time really looking at what are the opportunities and the challenges that the region has to contend with in this new reality, and probably just finish with an area that now I think most people take it for granted on macro stability, but there are issues in the horizon that we need to keep in focus. Okay, now this virtually summarizes the first 40 years. I don't want to spend a lot of time going back on this. First, I think it's well known by now that Africa's per capita income growth for the first 4 decades was extremely low, and is accounted for by 2 primary factors. And behind them, there are lots of stories which all of us have been writing about. First, in terms of growth accounting perspective, is a relatively low rate of capital accumulation. And here, slightly less than half of Africa's growth difference with other developing regions is due to slower accumulation of physical capital. Part of it is not simply because investment was not being made, but also the process of converting investment to capital accumulation itself also did have some leakage. And there are stories that one can review on this. The second part is a low productivity growth rate for investments that are made. And here, slightly more than half is accounted for by the slower growth in productivity. That is slightly more than half of the difference between the growth as observed in sub-Saharan Africa and the rest of the developing world is partly accounted by that. So going a little further down, investment levels since the 60s have remained relatively low in Africa. And here, I think in terms of the share of GDP averaging only half in the rest of the developing world. And also for similar levels of investment, African economies on average achieved only 1/3 to 1/2 of the growth for similar levels of investment rates. And if you look at the ICOs for the region, they were significantly higher than those that obtained elsewhere. So it's a combination of lower investment rate and lower productivity of investment coming from that. I'll not go into the many stories behind each one of those because that's not what I've targeted to cover mostly in this short presentation. Now, the second major feature is not only growth was low, but it was also erratic. In fact, if you looked at the pattern of growth for the first 40 years, it's almost an inverted U. The first decade, fairly reasonably high growth at around 3%. And then we had 2 decades of lost growth, where actually productivity collapsed. And then post-1995, you started again having growth. And in the years to come, which I'm going to go through, that rate was significantly higher. So we have to deal not only with the issue of low growth, but also its volatility. There is one other important observation that I need to make about these 40 years, is that in per capita terms, 2/3 of the difference with other developing economies actually was accounted for by delayed demographic transition. So the numerator, as opposed to the denominator, I spoke more about the numerator in the first few interventions I just did, but certainly the population growth side and the delay in demographic transition played a much, much bigger role when you look at per capita income growth. Now, but the last 2 decades, it looks like we have come now into a situation where we are seeing light and probably a good base for moving forward. Now, growth during this period averaged nearly 5% up to 2015. People will talk a bit about the last 2 years of commodity price collapse, but amazingly, the region has actually been able to ride through that without going into a spin of a vicious circle in the opposite direction as it used to be in the past. So, in fact, during this period, 16 out of the 30 fastest growing economies in the world were in the region. In PPP terms, over this period, the size of sub-Saharan African economy has grown to $4.2 trillion, which, if integrated into a single economy, actually would be the 6th largest economy at par with Germany. This is based on the IMF data for 2017. Previous comparisons was between the region and Belgium. That was the previous comparison, that all of us that have spent some years, looking at this was always a reference. So I looked up quickly before coming here, how does that compare with Belgium now? Actually, it is 8 times bigger than Belgium. And this should give us a sense of the quantum leap. Small numbers between 0.8% and 5% can make a huge difference if it is sustained. And sometimes we forget that partly just because of the smallness of the numbers. Now, if you take the African economy to include North Africa, then that number goes to 6.4 trillion, which actually would make it the 5th largest economy if integrated. Now, I'm using if integrated partly because ultimately this is one of the main, I think, recommendations that we should be thinking about in growing the size of that market. Now, there is also a big change in the structure, the country structure and the population structure in that growth. Currently, more than 60% of Africans now live in 30, actually 31 middle and high income countries. Whenever I talk about the high income countries, and you mention high income country in Africa, and when I ask the question, which countries are those, immediately people go to Botswana and Mauritius. It's not. It's Seychelles at 16,000 income per capita, nominal terms. And it is Equatorial Guinea, where also there is poverty of fairly high levels, which presents a case on its own. These two are already in the high income category. There are now 9 upper middle income countries in Africa and 19 lower middle income countries. I did, again, a quick search just to see whether the majority of these countries that are either high or upper middle income or lower middle income are resource-based. In looking at that, actually, only 7 out of the 30 are resource-rich countries. The rest are not, which means certainly this 2 decades, there has been a lot more that has happened fundamentally than typically we acknowledge. Now, a comparison is that in 2004, 13% of Africans lived in 13 countries which were middle-income countries. And we have now gone to 30, and the population being 60%. The big difference is some of the giant countries now have entered that space. So Nigeria now is actually in the lower middle-income countries, and you have Sudan, this is the North Sudan, which also has entered. But as I'll say later, there are still some giants that are missing, which would have helped to make a typical African probably be of much higher income if those countries also did grow. So the pattern of geographic distribution of growth to include the large countries is quite important, and I'll come back to that. Now, these are not just the numbers which can be taken very lightly, partly because even when you go to impact, as we'll see later, there has been also a big change. So currently, 1/3 of African population is middle class. This is ADB actually has done this work. This is based on 2016 analysis. And although the range there is $2 to $20 per day in PPP terms as defined, the gravitation is more around between 6 and 10 rather than on the 20 side. Now, what is also significant is that the middle class is growing much faster than the population. And this also makes for a much faster growth of the market on a regional scale. 100 million people were lifted out of poverty since 2000. This number is confirmed, and it is there. And poverty and life expectancy both improved over this period. Now, there is a figure I would like to go to and then come back to these other ones. This is the share of poor people in total population by region. And you can see the point of inflection for that in terms of sub-Saharan Africa. That's turning down just around 1995, the beginning of the 2 decades. And it's very clear that there is now a process of convergence which has started to the rest of the world. The other summary statistic of is life expectancy. And again, although there has been sort of a slow movement in that, it certainly picks up in the period, again, that we are referring to. Yeah. So, in essence, what one has seen is not only income improvements, but in terms of impact, both on poverty and on life expectancy, which ultimately should define the well-being of the typical African, that also has improved over this period. One big caveat, though. All this has happened without being accompanied by significant structural transformation. And this is the first big challenge that certainly we need to keep our minds focused on, which means growth, having been episodic before and vulnerable to commodity price shocks, remains still at risk of that unless structural transformation takes place. And the dualistic structure of the economy also persists, with the majority either in agriculture or informal sector activities, which both have fairly low productivity relative to the more modern sectors. And here, productivity growth for the aggregate economy, in this case, is being held back through this dualistic structure by the low productivity in those two sectors. So rural people have tended to move from agriculture into towns, but into informal jobs rather than modern jobs. As a result, productivity growth overall has not picked up as much as it has in other countries that experienced that. So based on this, my first call is certainly that structural transformation has now to be the next big push. We have been growing, but we have been growing without changing the structure to the extent that we should feel comfortable about. So if recent success has to be sustained, and to obtain traction for improved living standards and avoid market timing from stop and go, we must have structural transformation. And the evidence that I'm referring to is in the figures that we had looked at before. Just look at what East Asian situation has been. And when we talk about East Asia in terms of manufacturing, the research shows clearly we're talking about 6 countries or so, where most of the manufacturing moved from the West to that region in terms of emerging economy. But there are some traction results on that. This is true also even in terms of life expectancy results with East Asian economies moving more rapidly. This is just to show how important structural transformation would be to speed up this process of improvement that the region has experienced over the last 2 decades. Now, and when you look at what governments are saying and are planning, there is a sense of determination to succeed in catching up and structural transformation. And here the evidence is contained in the vision documents, virtually of all countries. Very ambitious in terms of catching up. We should run while they walk. This is the escalator, if you want, concept. So both closing income gaps with the rest of the world and also closing income gaps within the countries in terms of poverty. Also very ambitious about modernization, primarily via the well-tested escalator for industrialization. So all countries are actually targeting industrialization. And this is before the new reality on technology, which we'll discuss, actually started taking a much bigger presence in the dialogue. The story was the geese are flying westwards from China and other countries. They're likely to land in Africa, and countries are all prepared to receive that. Now, as we'll see, whether this new technological reality still has the same path for the geese or not. And this is part of what we'll talk about in the second part of this conversation. Now, one thing just to note, that although most nations have their targets ranging between 2025 and 2045, the African Union, which is the overall umbrella organization, has what it calls Agenda 2063. And that is the target year it has put for all these to be realized across the continent. So I think it takes into account the fact that there is major diversity across. Now, ultimately, however, for a typical African to be prosperous, talking about a typical African, countries with large populations, such as Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Africa, and Sudan, have actually to continue or start growing much faster, because that's where the majority of the Africans are. In fact, those 5 countries alone, 4 out of 10 Africans live in those countries. And if those countries do well, then the region does well. And the life of a typical African will be much more improved. So it is important that these large countries actually play a role. And it's not only that. There are also impacts that are linked to traction in terms of spillovers. Nigeria is big in its neighborhood. What happens to the neighborhood partly depends on the big Nigerian market. And if Nigeria grows, then a good number of countries around them would also be benefiting from that. So not only because of the sheer proportion of Africans living in them, but also for purposes of creating traction for the rest of the economy, it is important that these countries actually do. And it is also, I think, important that the demographic transition, which has now begun, actually gets completed, because that's one of the big challenges which is holding back faster progress. And finally, as we began with noting that growth has been volatile, and mainly because of shocks, managing shocks is quite important to make the growth more sustained and non-episodic. Now, we have seen, though, greater resilience being achieved at least on the last 2 decades. We have gone through 3 crises with fairly good average growth, and riding through those quite quickly. We went through the global financial crisis with the attendant global recession that followed. We went through the euro crisis which is quite important also for a good number of our countries, and recently through commodity price collapse. In the past, each one of those would probably have generated a tailspin in terms of a vicious circle. But for these last three, actually this has not been the case, except maybe in the last one or two of the big countries almost started going into the wrong direction. Partly, I think, because also of making sure that macro stability was always also part of this. And not only that, I think since 2008, the fund, which is an important partner across policy-wise, was convinced that counter-cyclical stance during crisis is important rather than be pro-cyclical by forcing austerity during times of collapse. I think both of those were quite important in changing this pattern of resilience. Now, quickly to the new technological reality. And now I think I'd better move much faster than I did before. First, artificial intelligence has put the role of manufacturing as a development escalator for catching up under threat. This is true for emerging industrialized economies. The challenge may be loss of jobs. We have one or two in the region, including Mauritius, for that matter, right? But for most of the countries, the challenge is more of missed opportunity for labor-intensive industrialization. The good thing with industrialization, as it happened in East Asia, not only did it have high productivity growth, but it also created jobs. With substitution of labor by robots, this is one of the key challenges we need to keep in mind in terms of the future. Jobless industrialization is an even bigger challenge in Africa at the time that we are facing an influx of young entrants into the labor market, which is a key challenge. And if we just look at this picture, you can see clearly that while almost everybody has either stabilized or is stabilizing or reducing the growth of young population, Africa will continue. Where in 2015, the number of youth were about 226 million. It is believed by 2050, it will be double that, at 450. And by 2080, Africa actually will overtake Asia in terms of absolute number of young people. So partly because while Asia's young population is declining, Africa's is actually continuing. And this is a big challenge that we need to see how jobs can be created actually to be able to absorb that growth in youth. Now, the second challenge in terms of this new technological reality is the pace of disruptive technological change. It's unprecedented and leaves little space for orderly adjustment. In effect, the speed is so high that for a number of countries in Africa, we haven't even started talking about what to do about this. And of course, technological change continues at a much faster rate. Reading some literature, it looks like the pace of technological change has actually increased over time, and it has become much, much faster in the last decade or so. And this presents a challenge also from perspective of space for adjustment. But there are also opportunities. I think the first opportunity is that there's much lower cost of diffusion and adoption of technology, and the threshold or scale for profitable application has also reduced very significantly, such that there is actually a process of democratization of technological application globally. And to give you an example of this, I'll use just this example of fintech in Tanzania and what it did to financial inclusion. In a span of 8 years, see what happened in terms based on mobile money platform in terms of access to formal financial services. It has gone overall from around 11% to 65.3%. But also, when you look at the divides in terms of gender, the divides are also closing on the basis of this, including the rural and urban divide. Even for the rural areas, just imagine between 2009 and 2017, the increase of access to formal financial service has increased from 11.4% to 57% in 8 years. In the previous 40 years, we went from 2% to 11.4%. The difference in terms of this story is actually mobile money and fintech. So even in the context of very low levels of educational capacities and also in terms of simply the ability to pay for investments, this could happen. And the only explanation would be certainly that the cost of adoption of technology is much, much lower, particularly for digital technology, and some of the AI from the data side. I think the other opportunity is lower and decreasing face-to-face costs, which now will expand the scope for global value chains beyond codifiable products. So you actually go into more complex products and also more complex management. We know the story about the expanded global value chains for services, which is the new major expansion of global value chains. But at the end of it, in African context, given that probably between 60 and 70% of all Africans derive their livelihoods from agriculture and informal activities, one has to see what technology can do within those sectors if the likelihood of moving all of them to modern sector is actually much challenged because of these changes. Right? And there we have looked at a number of cases, including in commodities, using Internet of Things and also blockchain technology. You can now do tracing of Ethiopian coffee right from the farm to the specialized market in America. And you can do that partly by making sure that the information is trusted. And I think there are a number of other examples of similar nature that we can go into. And for the informal market, its connectivity to formalization. You know about the gig economy, examples of Gojek in Indonesia. Kenya has its own versions of both Uber and also Gojek mostly began more in terms of motorcycle. And this is another opportunity that we should look at. So the main message I would like to drive from this is that our thoughts have always been the only escalator is manufacturing, and that if you miss manufacturing, then probably you don't have other alternatives. And therefore technology was being seen more from that perspective. But we know technology can also work with the other sectors, and this is partly what I think we need to put in place. Now, I saw already the sign that I have about 7 minutes, so let me go quickly now. Fact number one, strikingly, there's no global deindustrialization over the last 4 decades. And there is a paper in Economic Letters and reconfirmed by others, which shows that the share of manufacturing in employment has hovered around 14% since 1970, and as a share of value added at around 17% globally. Of course, it's true that geographically there are parts of the world that have lost, but there are other parts of the world that has gained. So what US, UK, Europe lost was actually gained, or more than gained, by the Asian economies. And it also says that probably the productivity growth of manufacturing, in this case, remains more or less at the same level as that of aggregate economy. So we can look at other components in the productivity growth space that could also take the place of manufacturing. But it's also true that demand has kept pace in terms of growth with productivity growth in manufacturing, because otherwise you wouldn't get this constancy. And therefore, I think we need also to look very much at the demand side, which I'll speak about also briefly. So I'm making just a point here that industrial productivity growth may not outstrip demand growth for some time. And partly because the growth points globally of demand for manufacturers is not in the developed world. It is in the emerging economies, where growth of incomes actually is much higher, and not only that, where the growth of middle class is even higher. And so I just did a quick comparison, 5 emerging economies, China, India, Russia, Brazil, and Indonesia. They have a total GDP per capita of 43.1 trillion. And when you compare that with GDP of US, EU, and Japan at 45, it's almost at par, these 5 and these major economies together. And it is actually these emerging economies where probably the growth of that demand will be much higher, partly because the more developed countries have gone more into services, etc. And who knows, manufacturers may soon become inferior goods like food in terms of shares. I'm not quite sure we are there yet, but the growth of demand will be there. Now, this point partly, goes to speak about reshoring. Most of the reshoring story is based on location of demand, providing in-time goods to meet that demand. This presumes that the locus of growth of demand actually is in those countries. But in actual fact, that's not where that locus is. And this poses a question. So I'll just go on questions. Countervailing reactions to job losses. So there are reaction functions. It's not like everybody takes this for granted. The first is that actually the largest growing or the largest share of the market for robots is actually in Asian economies. China accounts for 30% of that market on its own. And in terms of utilization, it's not robots per number of workers. That is still in the developed countries. I'm talking about the absolute number of robots. And when we speak to the Chinese policymakers and planners under the Commission's work, they are bent on keeping at least the value-added part of manufacturing in China, because they know there are spillover effects from that. Even if you don't have creation of direct jobs, there are creation of indirect jobs. And this is a major factor that also needs to be taken into account. And the other point, which I think is becoming clearer now, is that inequality is becoming a major issue, partly because profit shares from automation, actually profit share has been rising and labor share has been declining. And there are reactions to that too, which means we need to talk not only about the inequality effects, but also how we proceed with redistribution. In any case, I don't think we can proceed on this path because it's not sustainable. Robots don't eat. Robots don't wear clothes. The demand side has to be kept also in the picture in order to do this. Okay, now I'll go right to the end. But this picture, I like this picture. Partly it says, we have a bit of time. This is an example of the point of inflection switching from robots or to keeping just the... So the point of intersection of robot costs and wages is the point where that switch takes place. That switch is reached in US much earlier than in Kenya for furniture. And we can look probably at a number of other products. And this says we may still have a window. It might be 10, 15 years. And this only takes into account the comparison between wage and cost of robots, not taking into account the cost of raw materials depending on the source of raw materials, etc. So finally, I think I'll just go to the risks. I would be remiss not to talk about these particular sets of risks. There are three main risks, but let me talk about its debt sustainability challenges that the region now actually faces. When you look at public debt, it has been increasing very rapidly recently. 5 countries are virtually in distress. 18 countries has ratios which exceed 60% debt to GDP ratio, out of which 5 have ratios exceeding 90%. And I think the most important indicator is to look at the debt dynamics, and 17 countries already have real interest rates which exceed growth rates. And that is certainly an indication for trouble down the line. But it is also the structural characteristics of the debt. One is the risk of maturity mismatch. We have switched more to shorter term debt to pay for infrastructure. Typically, you start repaying debt even before you have completed investment. So you don't have the revenue stream to service the debt. And that becomes one of the challenges. And the other challenge is currency mismatch. Big drive on infrastructure, and everybody talks about that. That's a non-tradable. It has a stream of revenue in local currencies, but you are borrowing in foreign. This is a liquidity constraint that, again, these countries have to take into account. I think most of them are not yet in trouble, but it is important to keep these risks in sight. Thank you.
Really excellent presentation, and I should have mentioned, because all of this just reminds me, among many of the other things that Benno has done, many of you know of the African Economic Research Consortium, AERC, which is a wonderful institution. African students get their PhDs, so you can graduate from University of Ghana, and if there's a professor at Nairobi or Dar es Salaam, you can get a mentor there. And Benno was one of the first research directors, became executive director, and did a fantastic job there. So a lot of this material here, just reminds me of the good work there. So thank you for your great work on that as well. I'm going to open it up for questions, and as you're thinking of your questions, I loved everything he said here, but there's one little tiny part that I took really personally, okay? So I come from this really little tiny country called Ghana, and we're next door to Nigeria, and the Nigerians are always making fun of us. I mean, they say our country is like one of their states, okay? So Ghana will be very happy if I stand up for the country. So here is the counter argument. Bill Easterly has taught us that policies of neighbors matter. And so maybe Ghana, in getting its policies right, can teach Nigeria a thing or two, right?
Sure.
And so as we are doing our economies better, that's what's going on. And since you mentioned China, I think it was when Deng Xiaoping was in charge, he went over to an even tinier country, Singapore. He went to talk to Lee Kuan Yew. And so all of these reformations, changes in China was actually caused by a little itsy-bitsy tiny country, okay? And so let's not mess around with these small nations. That's my point there, okay? All right, questions?
I have about a question about 3 parts. One, what was the fundamental element that between the 2 decades that generated this process of growth? What happened? Who did it and how did it? Secondly, what has been the impact of investment of the Chinese on the African economies of various types? And then the last one is the issue of the migration of a lot of African students and young people to Europe and thereafter. Thank you.
Can we take a few more first?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, you want me to stand up? I want to thank you for your presentation. I wanted to say I'm an African who lived most of my life in this country, and I'm reflecting on this as not as an expert, but as an observer, somebody who's watched Africa from outside. So the headline news you delivered is 100 million people were lifted out of poverty. And I think that's a big news. But I do have issues with some of these conventional measurements that are used by the World Bank, IMF, and because they are kind of taken for granted that they are true. For example, if 100 million people were lifted out of poverty, if wealth was created, where are the employment numbers? Where are the exports? Those two always go together. And this is interesting because this is exactly what happened in Ethiopia. There are huge numbers that it shows for growth. But when you look at job creation, very little. Urban unemployment in some cases 70%. Exports are next to nothing. It's 3 billion. And debt is, debt repayment, interest on debt alone is close to $1 billion now. So all this kind of, I almost see like a desperation to come up with good news about Africa. You know, there's to have some good numbers to be put out there, but I think it's good to reflect, to step back and say, what is really going on the ground? And one thing I felt you did not mention enough is agriculture, which is Africa still cannot feed itself. You cannot industrialize without feeding your people. I mean, all these other countries that have done that, there are all these fancy models, you know. If it's a net importer of food, what it has is land and labor, and it's not using those and still not feeding its own people and borrowing or begging, you know. Finally, I want to say a little bit about technology. I'm a technologist here. I think we need to be careful about the bill of goods we are sold. Africa is a consumer of technology, not a creator of technology. Buying Chinese Huawei tablets or the Samsung phones or this or that. And all this promise is we're not the brain power doing this. Our money is being spent overseas in debt repayments and stealing and sending it overseas. And the young people are running away. They're sinking in the Mediterranean Sea. You know, they are all over. They cannot be sustained in their own country. And the reason I'm saying this is I think we kind of need to rethink kind of the conventional presentation about Africa's growth, what went wrong, and resist the temptation to paint a favorable picture. Thank you.
Please identify yourself before you speak, if you can.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. My name is Liz Grossman, and I'm an entrepreneur. I have a consulting company that works with leaders on the African continent, both established and emerging. And I have a question about that slide. Good leadership and strong institutions matter. I just want to know what your advice would be to leaders in order to, achieve all that you've put forward. What can leaders do?
I think let me start with the pessimism. I'm just telling that because you talked about optimism. You know, one of the things which is not in short supply about Africa is pessimism and not seeing for reality what's also happening. So I'll start with the poverty. Granted, you may have issues with the way poverty is measured, but we do have a whole range of other non-pecuniary measures of quality and livelihood. Life expectancy is one of those. We have seen major changes. I come from Tanzania. I know at independence, our life expectancy was 32 years. I know life expectancy now is 62 years. If you tell me nothing has happened, I don't know what then could have happened. I'm not saying that it is all over. It's not all over. I think if there is progress, and that's the story here, that we have begun, we need to build on that. And what do we do? And I don't know, ideas about how do we improve are much more, I think, useful for the region than simply, I mean, that story of saying it's hopeless, it's a story that has been there for decades. I told you about Belgium, yeah? How we were being compared in the past. Yeah? Granted that there could be, if there is one thing which is in short supply, is actually good news when it deserves to be told as good news from that region. We are very short of marketing. That's the truth. I don't know. I wish you had time. I want to go back with you to Tanzania and just show you some of the progress that has been made. And for people that have been there the last 20 years, and if they go there now, they'll tell you, I told you about mobile money. East Africa virtually was the frontier technologically of this in terms of application. The rest of the world was picking from it. My own country, in terms of interoperability, is the first country in the world to achieve interoperability among MNOs. It did that 5 years ago. But these are facts. Not only that, we spoke about technology. There are young men there that are producing solutions. They have startups producing solutions as aggregators, for example, aggregation. You have mobile money, you have services. You need a platform through which you go from payment, actually, to paying the services. A good number of those solutions, I'm not talking about the core technology. Core technology is developed here and in the developed countries. But a good number of the solutions that are specific to the problems that are being resolved. You go to Kenya. I would like to invite you also to go and look at the centers where startups are actually being incubated. You'll be amazed. I think these young people who are making something out of themselves ought to have serious encouragement. Yeah. So I don't know. I've been here, I've been there. I just finished serving as central bank governor there, so I know also what the problems are. But I've also seen things. And I think it is partly that. And maybe this should take me to the problem also of migration of these young people. To a very large extent, that's the youth problem that I was referring to. We can turn that into a demographic dividend. We need to think about what are the alternatives. We can't just lament. Of course, if there are no alternatives, they find alternatives wherever they can find them. And I think a good solution to this problem of migration is partly to see how we can really create opportunities in situ. For example, digital labor markets. People don't have to move in order to work for an entity in United States. You do it while there. This is the globalization of value chains in services, and also the growth of digital markets. These are all quite important, and they can, provide solutions. The Chinese. No, China is in Africa more as a contractor rather than an investor. People forget about this. They win almost 25 to 30% of all infrastructure projects funded by others, not funded by themselves. That's their biggest presence. They build the railways, they build the roads, they build, and they win because purely of costing as seen now, but a number of countries have started to see big holes in that, in the contracting system. You get to pay a lot more through other ways. But this is where now these things are coming actually to the fore. I know for sure in Tanzania, Chinese are there more simply as contractors, not as investors. Yeah. They have started looking at investment. And very often in exchange for natural resources or the rights to natural resources. But suddenly there are a number of countries, I don't want to mention, including presidents, who have started reacting to that, partly because they know sometimes it's a raw deal. But these are exactly the things that also we should look at. For the leaders, I think not benevolent despots. This is my opinion. You can have some very strong leaders who do things very efficiently, but at the expense of democracy. Countries have to choose. And there are countries that are not willing to give up on freedoms in order to move very quickly through that kind of arrangement. It is leaders supported by institutions that will make good leadership sustainable, that will have checks and balances that actually ultimately makes a big difference. I know we have a few who everybody talks about, more from maybe Lee Kuan Yew perspective, without institutions. That type is very different. Yeah. And I don't know, this is my opinion. I'm not representing any other view of government or otherwise, just in case. I think good leadership, which A, makes sure that property rights are in place, that adjudication of disputes is fair and transparent, that pays attention to efficacy in expenditures, and definitely pays attention to corruption. That would define for me a good package of the qualities. Now, how you sustain those qualities over time with our election cycles, that's a different thing. Because you may have this with this person. If institutions are not there, the next person who comes in is not as good, then there is an issue. So that's why I think it's that combination, leadership and strong institutions, that should make for a difference.
Alex Hulka from the United Nations Economic Policy Analysis. I see a colleague here too. Thank you for the presentation. It's a thought-provoking presentation, but also we want that you develop your ideas of that, maybe some questions and some caveats would apply. Two questions. One is that, can you clarify, when you talk about reduction of poverty, are you talking about reduction of extreme poverty, which is what the World Bank also is engaged to, or reduction of absolute poverty. The absolute poor in the world is much, much bigger. Right?
Yeah.
So this is, we have to separate, because otherwise we could find people saying, well, I see a lot of poor still, etc. So that's one question. The other question is that what I like actually is that you have set up of the opportunities and new developments in technology in some African countries. But I wonder if you can develop some typologies, because you are good in putting some countries which are have better economic capacities, or maybe even weaknesses also in terms of too much population. So can you think about in the future, or how could you, develop that kind of, so they would be more helpful for developing the diversity you are talking about of development pathways? Mm-hmm. And the last question is that you, in the environment, I missed the environment factor to, to talk about sustainable development. And I know it's much more complex. I mean, you guys giving us enough food for thought, as I said at the beginning, but just want to push you further, because you also talk about leapfrogging. And what is the links, for example, technologically speaking, leapfrogging is well understood, and you have given that talk about it. But leapfrogging in terms of how the environmental resources of African countries, how could be industrialized and provoke and link with the technological fast growth with leapfrogging? Which ways, could be examples of leapfrogging? Thank you.
So my team tells me that we've actually run out of time, and so I'll take 2 more questions if they're one-liners. Okay, so please put your hand down if you don't have a one-liner. I'll take the lady here and one person from here. Go ahead, sir. One-liners.
Ephraim Kitoi from Benin Republic. I have 2 questions, actually. One is, what do you think about Francophone African countries and the CFA? Coming from a central bank, how do you see that? Number 2 is, I have an issue understanding what's happening in Africa when you have young people who want to work, they want to do things, and everybody agrees that you create riches just through work, like by creating, by doing things. People want to work, but there's no job. Young people are begging to work, and there's just nothing to do. What do you think about that?
Hi, my name is Cheryl Gittins-Bailey. I'm from the Institute of Global Innovation. I have 2 brief points. brief points. One is about education and human capacity development, and the other is about alternative energy and using technology as a means of leapfrogging over existing energies.
I think most of the points are for further development of the discussion, so it's not necessarily to be able to respond. But this concern about young people, I take that. It's one of the key challenges, just creating jobs that are attractive to young people. A good number of those are going through an education scale. You don't expect them to go back to farming. And certainly when you look at the average age of farmers in most African countries, it has progressed, meaning you are not getting replacement of younger people in that. So we have to look for opportunities beyond agriculture. And there are schemes, and we can talk about those schemes. But there is one challenge that really which is coming up now, which I personally think is quite troubling. And it's related to technology. And this is gambling and betting through fintech platforms. It's incredible how fast, partly linked to the fact that they think they can become rich very fast without having to work in exactly the ways that everybody else has been thinking about. And to make it worse, because I come from the financial sector side, We have developed microcredit programs, unsecured credit through, credit scoring that uses big data, etc. And young people are borrowing to bet. Yeah? And it's causing a problem not only for them becoming more or less addicted, through this. Even as I sit in the office here, I get all these prompts right on my phone about the next bet. And there are more than 30 different betting games that come to my phone every day. And for the young people, this is becoming a major issue. But these are also global programs, eh? So it's not, they're not local in most of these, sports betting. So I think we need also to look at this other side of technology. It's not all good, much as I think fintech on balance has done a lot more good than bad, but these are some of the bad that we can actually control. And I just wanted to share with you that partly because it's a passion I've developed recently, and I see this seriously catching like wildfire all across East Africa, which is the closest market I know, and probably also in other places. You bet on soccer, tournaments in UK and in Germany, and whoever is winning, and most of them lose money anyway. To the extent, just to give you an example, I have a cousin I wanted to send some money to, even from here, and then he tells me, don't send this money to this number. It owes money. Send it to another one. And because I know what that means, of course I told him no, if this is the purpose. Yeah. But this is one of the things that I think on sustainable development and the energy part, these are two I think that should go together. I think most of the energy interventions from technology can be helpful also in making our environment much more sustainable. The rest I'll take as good ideas to continue thinking about. Thank you.